The modern historical consensus on the religious views of Adolf Hitler would have you believe that, as a man thirsting for ultimate power, Hitler first manipulated the public in the early years by embracing an overtly Christian message.
Sie sollen heute nicht reden plötzlich des roten Christentum. Das werden wir in Schutz nehmen.
Behind the scenes, however, he viewed Christianity as weak, Jewish-inspired, and sought to undermine the institution because it ideologically ran contrary to both National Socialism and the German folk. Hitler would then push concepts of Nietzsche, of will to power and the Superman, while embracing more pagan beliefs and aesthetics. Some would go even further to say that Hitler had an obsession with the occult and sent his henchmen all over the world looking for ancient Aryan artifacts or religious relics as portrayed in Hollywood films and mainstream media pseudo-historical television shows. Hitler would then declare war on the churches and persecute Christians, with a final plan to completely eradicate Christianity from Germany. But is any of this true? Or are we subject to the victor's version of history? Was Hitler truly anti-Christian, or did an extremely vocal minority both before and after the war push this message for insidious purposes? Let's explore these questions and set the record straight. This is Christianity in the Third Reich. The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion was first published in 1903 in Russia. From there it spread through multiple editions across Europe and to the United States, where it was popularized by Henry Ford. This document was instrumental in inciting anti-Semitism throughout the world. While mainstream historians will tell you it is a forgery, no one can deny how prophetic the document was in predicting that Jews would control global finance and manipulate markets to create economic crises. Jews would control the press to shape public opinion. Jews would foment revolutions to seize power, and that Jews would weaken Christianity by promoting secular or liberal ideologies to destabilize societies. We will now look at two specific quotes from the Protocols. Quote 1 is from Protocol 2. It reads, "The intellectuals, the Goyim, are proud of their knowledge without logical verification, and put into practice all the notions dealing with science, written by our agents, with the intention of forming the minds in ways that will prove useful." The translator remembers the successes of Darwinism, of Marxism, of Nietzscheanism, and the other unproven doctrines. Russian journalist Pavel Khrushchevin, the first translator and publisher of the Protocols, added this translator's note linking Darwin, Marx, and Nietzsche to the Jewish agents referred to in the text. In 1905, Christian mystic Sergei Nilus published the first unabridged Russian translation of the Protocols, and this translator's note was fused in as the actual word of the Jews in all subsequent editions. Nevertheless, these men saw these three challenges of the status quo as being a threat to Christianity and their teachings being amplified by the Jew. What do Darwin, Marx, and Nietzsche all have in common? All three favored materialism over spirituality. While Nietzsche did write of the spirit, it is a spirit from within and absent of the supernatural or religious essence. The National Socialists most certainly opposed Marxism. However, there were prominent National Socialists who did push the ideas of Darwin and Nietzsche. We will dive more into National Socialist principles later on. Quote 2 is from Protocol 17. It reads, "The King of the Jews will be the real Pope of the universe, the Patriarch of the International Church. But in the meantime, while we are re-educating youth in new traditional religions and afterwards in ours, we shall not overtly lay a finger on existing churches, but we shall fight against them by criticism calculated to produce schism." New traditional religions and later in ours? How could a traditional religion be new? This brings us to a man named Guido von List, an Austrian occultist. Von List is widely regarded as the father of modern Wotanism and the more esoteric Armanism. In 1908, he formed the List Society, where among the members were prominent Jews such as the rabbinical scholar Moritz Altschuler and writer Ernst Wachler. Why would von List, a supposed anti-Semite, have Jews in his society? It is because von List believed that 8th century Armanists had imparted their secret teachings to the Jewish rabbis of Cologne in the hope of preserving them from Christian persecution. He believed that these teachings became the Kabbalah, which he therefore reasoned was an ancient German and not Jewish innovation, thus legitimizing its usage in his own teachings. Remember what the protocols said about new traditional religions and later in ours. Was this yet another successful prediction from the protocols? This theory of the Kabbalah was also shared by Rudolf John Gorsleben, founder of the Edda Society in 1925. From Gorsleben's The Zenith of Humanity, he writes, "The Kabbalah is the Germanic wisdom that has been saved in the synagogue from the prosecution of the church." Another member of the Edda Society was Matilda von Chemnitz, whose third husband was General Erich Ludendorff, one of the most highly decorated German generals of World War I. The Ludendorffs believed in global conspiracy, consisting of world Jewry, Freemasonry, Rome, and Asian occult priests like the Dalai Lama, and that they all were a threat to German beliefs. General Ludendorff would participate with Hitler in the beer hall putsch, but unlike Hitler, would serve no jail time afterwards and was acquitted of charges of high treason. Upon being released from prison, the relationship between Ludendorff and Hitler became strained, as Hitler viewed the beliefs of Ludendorff and his wife as fringe and incapable of achieving broad appeal. The Ludendorffs would start an organization called the Tannenberg Bund that at once had up to 100,000 members. The Tannenberg Bund failed to win support of the masses and eventually slipped away into irrelevancy. The organization was suppressed in 1933 and deemed non-compliant with National Socialist ideology. Ludendorff would go on to become a public critic of Hitler. However, it was Hitler who was proven correct that the ideas pushed forth by the Ludendorffs would fail to achieve mass appeal. Another occult group operating in Germany was the Thule Society, founded in 1918 by Rudolf von Sebottendorf, who would leave the society just 1 year later. There is a myth that the Thule Society had an influence on National Socialism, but the reality is much different. While Rudolf Hess and Hans Frank were members, Hitler was never a member. And in 1920, Hitler made Thule and NSDAP membership mutually exclusive, more than a decade before the NSDAP controlled Germany. Sebottendorf, the founder, emerged again in 1933 and wrote a book claiming paganism shaped the NSDAP. Sebottendorf's book was banned in Germany, and he was arrested and deported to Turkey, where he ended his days as a drunk. If the NSDAP wasn't shaped by paganism, let us now move on to what principles were at the core of National Socialism, as well as Hitler's speeches and writings, to see where we find Christianity among them. On August 31, 1927, Adolf Hitler had this to say about the NSDAP party program.
"The program is fixed, and I shall never suffer changes in the principles of the movement as laid down in its program."
In Section 1 of the program, entitled The Policy of the NSDAP, it reads, "Attacks on religion and the clergy. We cannot declare too often that the NSDAP is not dreaming of attacking the Christian religion and its worthy servants. It is the corrupting policy of the Center and the Bavarian People's Party which we attack. These lose no opportunity of crying church in danger, except when they are making common cause with the atheistical, God-denying social democracy. It is because we have so high and holy an ideal of man's relation towards his God that we hate to see religion besmirched with the dirt of political conflict." In Section 2, the 25 points of the NSDAP, Point 24 reads, "We demand liberty for all religious denominations in the state, so far as they are not a danger to it and do not militate against the moral feelings of the German race. The party as such stands for positive Christianity, but does not bind itself in the matter of creed to any particular confession. It combats the Jewish materialist spirit within us and without us, and is convinced that our nation can only achieve permanent health from within on the principle, the common interest before self. This is one of two parts in the 25 points that uses bold text to coincide with Hitler's two main points: the common interest before self, the spirit of the program, and abolition of the thraldom of interest, the core of National Socialism. As you can see, positive Christianity coincides with one of the two main points of the program. In section 4, titled The Program Requirements in Detail, under the subheading The Federal Character of the Reich, the third of the three main obstacles to the program reads, "Our campaign against Mammon, which ranks above the other two, is directed against the world-embracing power of money, i.e., the perpetual exploitation of our nation by the great lending houses." Mammonism is a biblical term from Matthew 6:24. The Bible verse states, "Ye cannot serve God and mammon." Mammon meaning the seductive power of money that can lead to moral corruption or spiritual neglect. And finally, in the subheading Religion and Art, the program reads, "The same applies to all the stupid attacks on Christianity. Expressions such as Christianity has only done harm merely show that the man who says them has neither human nor political intelligence. One may well blame the church for meddling in politics, and all good Christians will disapprove the cruelties practiced in the name of the cross by the Inquisition and trials for witchcraft. But it is wrong to abuse in general terms the greatest phenomenon in human history for the mistakes and depravities of individuals. The Christian religion has raised and edified millions and millions and brought them to God by the way of suffering. The culture of the Middle Ages stood up in the sign of the cross. Achievement, sacrifice, courageous faith have their roots in Christianity. Thus, we must be careful to distinguish the inner spiritual kernel of Christianity from the various forms of excrescence which have appeared upon it in its passage through history. Our party stands upon the basis of positive Christianity. This is not the place to discuss all the problems, hopes, and desires as to whether the German nation may at some time discover some new form for its religious beliefs and experiences. These are matters quite beyond the limits of a program such as that of National Socialism. The party program is very straightforward in saying that it stands on positive Christianity, in a way to unify German Christians of different denominations to become one German folk. While someone may have criticisms of specific denominations, the party clearly holds Christianity in high regard. With the last statement that says the German people may in the future discover a new religion, there are those that claim that the NSDAP was creating a window of opportunity or an exit strategy to Christianity in the attempts to replace the religion with some sort of Germanic paganism. Let us now look at Hitler's opinions on pagans like the Thule Society in Mein Kampf. From Volume 1, Chapter 12, what you are about to hear is a long scathing rebuke of pagans by Hitler on how they are cowards, political failures with terrible ideas, and how they are subversives because they hinder unity and thus help the enemy.
If there is anything which is non-folkish, it is this messing about with old Germanic expressions, in particular, which neither suit the present time nor conjure up a definite picture. It is a mischievous habit, but it is very prevalent nowadays. At that time and subsequently, I had to warn followers repeatedly against these wandering folkish scholars who never accomplished anything positive or practical except to cultivate their own superabundant self-conceit. In most cases, they come because they think that, under the aegis of the movement, it will be possible for them to promulgate their old ideas to the misfortune of their new listeners. Anyhow, nobody ever seems able to make out what exactly these ideas are. It is typical of such persons that they rant about ancient Teutonic heroes of the dim and distant ages, stone axes, battle spears and shields, whereas in reality, they themselves are the woefulest poltroons imaginable. For they are the very same people who brandish Teutonic tin swords that have been fashioned carefully according to ancient models and wear padded bearskins with the horns of oxen mounted over their bearded faces, proclaim that all contemporary conflicts must be decided by the weapons of the mind alone, and skedaddle at the very sight of a communist blackjack. Posterity will have little occasion to write a new epic on these heroic gladiators. I have seen too much of that kind of person not to feel a profound contempt for their miserable play acting. To the masses of the nation, they are just an object of ridicule. But the Jew finds it to his own interest to treat these folkish comedians with respect and to prefer them to real men who are fighting to establish a German state. Among these people, there are some whose conduct can be explained by their innate stupidity and incompetence, but there are others who have a definite ulterior purpose in view. Often, it is difficult to distinguish between the two classes. The impression which I often get, especially of those so-called religious reformers whose creed is grounded on ancient Germanic customs, is that they are the missionaries and protégés of those forces which do not wish to see a national revival taking place in Germany. All their activities tend to turn the attention of the people away from the necessity of fighting together for a common cause against the common enemy, namely the Jew. Moreover, that kind of preaching induces the people to use up their energies not in fighting for the common cause, but in absurd and ruinous religious controversies within their own ranks. Those people of whom I have spoken hate such a movement because it is capable of putting a stop to their mischief. Therefore, we considered the friendship of such people as not only worthless, but even dangerous to our young movement. It was not without good reason that when we laid down a clearly defined program for the new movement, we excluded the word folkish from it. That was the principal reason why we first called ourselves a party. We hoped that by giving ourselves such a name, we might scare away a whole host of folkish dreamers. And that was also the reason why we named our party the National Socialist German Workers' Party.
Now ask yourself, does this sound like someone who is secretly a pagan? Or is it Hitler expressing with absolute disdain his personal experiences dealing with these people? Hitler does not criticize Christianity in Mein Kampf, but he does criticize Christian socialism.
The Christian socialist movement had only a vague conception of a German revival as part of its object, but it was intelligent and fortunate in the choice of means to carry out its policy as a party. The Christian socialists grasped the significance of the social question, but they adopted the wrong principles in their struggle against Jewry, and they utterly failed to appreciate the power of the national idea.
Hitler also criticizes the Christian socialists who aligned with the Catholic Church because the religious-only and not racial aspect of anti-Semitism could be bypassed by the Jews by falsely converting to Catholicism through baptism. One section of Mein Kampf that is frequently taken out of context as an attack on Christianity comes from Volume 2, Chapter 5, titled Worldview and Organization. It reads,
"A worldview is intolerant and cannot permit another to exist side by side with it. It can never allow the previous state of affairs to continue in existence alongside it. The same holds true of religions. Christianity was not content with erecting an altar of its own. It had first to destroy the pagan altars. It was only by virtue of this passionate intolerance that an apodictic faith could grow up, and intolerance is an indispensable condition for the growth of such a faith. It may be objected here that in these phenomena which we find throughout the history of the world, we have to recognize mostly a specifically Jewish mode of thought, and that such fanaticism and intolerance are typical symptoms of the Jewish mentality. This may be true 1,000 times over, and we may regret that it is so. And note with a feeling of uneasiness that this phenomenon has hitherto been unknown in the history of mankind. But the hard fact remains that such is the situation today. A philosophy of life which is inspired by a fanatical spirit of intolerance can only be set aside by a doctrine that is advanced in an equally ardent spirit and fought for with as determined a will, and which is itself a new idea, pure and absolutely sincere. Each one of us today may regret the fact that the advent of Christianity was the first occasion on which spiritual terror was introduced into the much freer ancient world. But the fact cannot be denied that ever since then, the world has been pervaded and dominated by this kind of coercion, and that violence is broken only by violence and terrorism by terrorism. Only then can a new regime be created by means of constructive work. Political parties are prone to make compromises, but a worldview never does this. A political party even reckons with opponents, but a worldview proclaims its own infallibility.
Hitler is not criticizing Christianity, but explaining how National Socialism needs to adopt a fanatic and intolerant worldview that destroys all other worldviews. He addresses how people may have issues with what Christianity did to pagans in the past, but one worldview could not live with the other. Hitler once said that he disagrees with Himmler on his opinions of Charlemagne using violence against pagans by saying,
"Killing all those Saxons was not a historical crime as Himmler thinks. Charlemagne did a good thing in subjugating Widukind and killing the Saxons out of hand. He thereby made possible the empire of the Franks and entry of Western culture into what is now Germany."
Charlemagne, of course, would go on to lay the foundation for the Holy Roman Empire, or the First Reich, and is considered the father of Europe. In the same volume and chapter, Hitler once again explains how National Socialism needs to do as Christians had done in order to succeed.
Here again, the Catholic Church has a lesson to teach us. Though sometimes, and often quite unnecessarily, its dogmatic system is in conflict with the exact sciences and with scientific discoveries, it is not disposed to sacrifice one syllable of its teachings.
This sentiment is also expressed in Volume 1, Chapter 12, where Hitler writes,
"The greatness of Christianity did not arise from attempts to make compromises with those philosophical opinions of the ancient world, which had some resemblance to its own doctrine, but in the unrelenting and fanatical proclamation and defense of its own teaching."
Hitler sees in Christianity and the Catholic Church as something for the NSDAP to emulate, while at the same time bashing pagans for their scattered ideas that cannot form an intolerant worldview. These free-thinking pagan ideas run contrary to the authoritarian worldview of National Socialism. Mein Kampf itself is dedicated to a Catholic, a man named Dietrich Eckart, who was Hitler's mentor during his early aspirations in politics. In the next chapter, we will explore the ideas and men that shaped Hitler's worldview and investigate where Christianity fit into the equation. But first, here are excerpts of Hitler's speeches where Christianity is spoken of.
My feeling as a Christian points me to my Lord and Savior as a fighter. It points me to the man who once in loneliness, surrounded only by a few followers, recognized these Jews for what they were and summoned men to the fight against them, and who, God's truth, was greatest not as sufferer but as fighter. In boundless love as a Christian and as a man, I read through the passage which tells us how the Lord at last rose in his might and seized the scourge to drive out of the temple the brood of vipers and of adders. How terrific was his fight for the world against the Jewish poison. Today, after 2,000 years, with deepest emotion, I recognize more profoundly than ever before the fact that it was for this that he had to shed his blood upon the cross. As a Christian, I have no duty to allow myself to be cheated, but I have the duty to be a fighter for truth and justice. We will never allow a religious quarrel to arise in this movement. We say rather, the church may educate the parties to religious service. We educate them to fight and to preserve its worldview and its foundations. We do not tolerate anyone in our ranks who offends the ideas of Christianity, who stands up to a dissident, fights him, or provokes himself as a hereditary enemy of Christianity. This movement of ours is actually Christian. Once as the first prerequisite for the organization of our folk on a large scale, Germany had an ideological foundation in our religion, Christianity. When this ideological foundation was shaken, we see how the strength of the nation turned away from external things and toward the internal conflicts. The national government will therefore regard it as its first and foremost duty to re-establish the unity of spirit and will of our folk. It will preserve and defend the foundations upon which the power of our nation rests. It will extend its strong protecting hand over Christianity as the basis of our entire morality, and the family as the germ cell of the body of our folk and state. The national government perceives in the two Christian confessions the most important factors for the preservation of our folkdom. It will respect any contracts concluded between these churches and the states. Today, we have this authority and will more easily be able to win the struggle for these principles. But we will never wage this battle as a battle against Christianity or even against one of the two confessions.
The belief that Jesus was an Aryan fighter against the Jews was not a new idea formed by the NSDAP. This belief would be found in German philosophy, theology, and eventually politicians from the mid-19th century to the 20th century. German philosophers Johann Gottlieb Fichte and Friedrich Hegel both believed Jesus to not be a Jew. Theologian Bruno Bauer argued Jesus was of Hellenistic descent. German biblical scholar Paul de Lagarde wrote of a masculine Jesus who was contrary to everything Jewish. German composer Richard Wagner and his son-in-law, philosopher Houston Stewart Chamberlain, also believed Jesus to not be a Jew. Protestant pastor Friedrich Naumann and chaplain Adolf Stöcker, founder of the anti-Semitic Christian Social Workers Party, laid the foundation for Christian anti-Semitic ideas moving into politics. National Socialist theoretician Rudolf Jung, who in 1919 wrote Der nationale Sozialismus, described Naumann as a forerunner of National Socialism. Der nationale Sozialismus was a foundational work that was released 4 years before Gottfried Feder's The German State on National and Social Basis, and 6 years before Mein Kampf. In Der Nationalsozialismus, Jung writes, "If in certain circles today some now reject Christianity as something alien, as something which simply does not accord with our nature, and if they instead choose to form German believing, then they are abandoning our conviction to a serious delusion. These attempts will never get beyond the formation of sects, and therefore will never achieve their purpose of engulfing our entire folk, and not just individual circles of it, in a new religious wave which will liberate them from materialism. Instead, and regardless of all the good and honest intentions which are undoubtedly behind them, these efforts will only achieve one thing, that the already existing ecclesiastical turmoil, which is our misfortune, will be multiplied." Jung believes that embracing paganism will lead to a rift between church and state and further divide Germans. In the work, Jung also quotes from Oswald Spengler's book, Prussianism and Socialism, with this quote about Charles Darwin: "For 2 centuries now, the Englishman has been the inventor of all philosophies that do away with inner independence, most recently of Darwinism, which makes man's entire mental state causally dependent upon material forces, and which, via the particularly slick form propagated by Büchner and Haeckel, has become the worldview of the German Philistine." Also in Der nationale Sozialismus, Jung gives the history of Jewish usury in Europe and how it was the reason for Jewish persecution. These ideas formed the party program, and thus it is clear that the party program of the NSDAP can only be understood through a Christian anti-Semitic lens, due to the fact that the 2 main points of the program, as stated before, deal with usury and the common interest before self. The 2 biggest influences on Hitler during the early years were Theodor Fritsch and Dietrich Eckart. Fritsch, a German publisher and journalist, was a party member until his death in 1933. His writing was considered key reading to NSDAP members. One such book was titled The False God. In the book, Fritsch argues that the ancient traditions of the Israelites were Aryan, before they were influenced by a Jewish priestly caste to believe in Yahweh. Fritsch believed that Jesus was an Aryan of Galilean descent because he was the son of a Roman soldier. He saw Christianity as an Aryan protest against the inhumane spirit of the Jews. Dietrich Eckart was Hitler's mentor and father figure. Eckart wrote a book entitled Bolshevism from Moses to Lenin in 1924 that was a fictitious conversation between himself and Hitler. The character of Hitler in the book condemns the Old Testament and Paul, but also says that Jesus is an Aryan warrior who fought against the Jews. The character of Hitler in the book says that Paul distorted the teachings of Jesus to be more universal and pacifist. Was this Hitler's actual view of the Apostle Paul? There are those who argue that Hitler was an admirer of Paul and saw parallels between himself and the apostle, due to them both being physically blinded before taking on their missions. At the end of the day, The evidence on Hitler's opinion of Paul is all speculation, and there is no definitive proof either way. Dietrich Eckart would go on to inspire point 24 of the party program, the standpoint of the party. Eckart also introduced Alfred Rosenberg to Hitler. Alfred Rosenberg's book, Myth of the 20th Century, is a confusing work that many falsely interpret as anti-Christian. Hitler himself said, "It is a very clever book. Only I ask myself who today is likely to read and understand such a book." Joseph Goebbels referred to it as an ideological belch. It was a book that was praised publicly by party members, but privately ridiculed. Published in 1930, the book was primarily known only in intellectual and party circles. In 1934, the Vatican placed Myth of the 20th Century on the prohibited books list, which caused interest and sales to soar. In the book, Rosenberg was critical of Catholic indulgences, calling it usury. He also believed some of the Gospels contained forgery, such as Matthew 16:18, where Jesus says that Peter is his rock, that he will build the church on. Rosenberg was critical of the Catholic Church and favored Protestantism more, saying it blazed a path for all that today we regard as our greatest works of culture and science. Rosenberg also writes that the Gospel of Mark is the real core of the message of the child of God. This stands in opposition to the Semitic doctrine of the slave of God. The Gospel of John was the first Gentile interpretation. Regarding the ethnicity of Jesus, Rosenberg writes, "There is no proof for the often made claim that Jesus was a Jew. Indeed, there is much to show the contrary. Jesus possibly was Aryan, or partially so, showing the Nordic type strongly." In the introduction to the third edition of the book, Rosenberg discusses the backlash received from the churches. He writes, "The great respect which is shown the founder of Christianity in the work was overlooked. It was deliberately concealed that my religious observations have the clear intention of viewing his great personality without the eternal distortions by various churches. It was omitted that I rendered Wotanism as a dead religious form, and in an unscrupulous manner, the fantasy was concocted that I wished to reintroduce the pagan cult of Wotan. It is clear from those surrounding Hitler, as well as what he said in his speeches, that Hitler actually believed that Jesus was an Aryan fighter. To those who believe that Hitler was a secret pagan, they would have to also believe that Hitler lied to all his early mentors, the people closest to him, and then eventually the German people. Does this seem plausible? One may not agree with the theology of these men, who had different views amongst themselves, but to say that they are anti-Christian is entirely false. Perhaps then, Hitler changed his mind about Christianity later on, due to battles he had with the churches. But why did these battles between church and state arise? We will explore this and more in the next chapter. When Hitler obtained power in 1933, 95% of Germans were Christian, with 63% being Protestant and 32% being Catholic. It's obvious that Hitler saw limitations in the doctrines of the Church. In a speech in 1923, he stated,
"Christianity is not the teaching of silent suffering, but of battle. We have a duty as Christians to combat injustice with every means that Christ has given us. And now, the time has come to fight with a sword."
Some historians believe that the NSDAP had a plan to eradicate Christianity from the Reich, while other historians argue that while there were anti-Christian individuals in the party, they did not represent the movement's position as a whole. We will now discuss the denominations that were operating in National Socialist Germany. In the spring of 1933, Hitler eliminated Catholic-aligned political parties. As shown previously in the program, Hitler disagreed with the Catholic Socialists aligning with Marxist atheists on occasion. In 1927, Hitler exchanged letters with Magnus Gott, a Catholic priest in Augsburg, and a supporter of the NSDAP since 1922. The exchange began over a 1924 article published by the NSDAP expressed hostility towards the Catholic Church. Hitler assured him not to judge the NSDAP too harshly, and it was not their fault some in the NSDAP were walking away from churches. Hitler then said that just as Peter denied Christ 3 times, he was the rock the church was built on, and that National Socialism was a true crusade for the Christianity of the Lord. Hitler also said, The greater the distance between politics and religion, the less damage religion risked suffering because of the liberal freedom of politics, science, and the arts. While Christianity had conducted its crusade against the heathens, National Socialism conducted its political crusade against the states of today, against the poisoning of the race, the splintering of the people, and the destruction of the fatherland. Hitler then stated how he can picture the German people one day standing united with the hooked cross on the left side of the sword and the Lord's cross on the right side. There were some in the Catholic Church that felt the doctrines of Catholicism and National Socialism could be harmonized. Karl Adam, Germany's most influential Catholic theologian, wrote in 1933, "But the hour came, and we saw him and recognized him. He now stands before us as the one who has been prophesied by our poets and our wise men, who is the liberator of German genius." In 1934, Austrian Bishop Alois Hudal met privately with Pope Pius XI because Hudal believed an understanding could be met between the Catholic Church and National Socialism. The Church felt that the National Socialists were already in breach of the Concordat signed the year prior. Pius felt there would never be compromise between National Socialists and Christianity because National Socialism was a massive materialism. However, he wished Bishop Hudal good luck in his efforts. Hudal felt that there were parallels of Catholicism and National Socialism, such as authoritarianism and anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism of the Church, though, was religious and not racial. He was familiar with Mein Kampf and felt he knew Hitler because of Hitler's upbringing with Catholicism in Austria. Hitler writes in Mein Kampf,
Since in my free time I received singing lessons in the cloister at Lambach, I had excellent opportunity to intoxicate myself in the splendor of the brilliant church festivals.
Hitler's music instructor when he was a child, Bernhard Gruner, once spoke to a journalist about Hitler, saying, "The hooked cross in here in our abbey impressed itself upon the child, and the little Hitler dreamed of it endlessly." Hudal met with Vice-Chancellor Franz von Papen with his proposal of a Catholic fusion with National Socialism. Papen saw the potential and spoke to Hitler about it, who expressed great interest. In 1936, Papen would present to Hitler a manuscript called Foundations of National Socialism, written by Hudal. Hitler was interested, but Joseph Goebbels took the manuscript and said he would review it first. He found 17 points of serious contention, which Hudal would go on to correct. The manuscript still caused infighting amongst the party. Hitler, Göring, Hess and Neurath favored the book, but Rosenberg opposed, and Goebbels had still not given his official yes. Hitler endorsed the book and it went to publishing. In a meeting, Papen presented a copy to Hitler. An argument ensued for hours, with Papen asking Hitler to give the book a party endorsement, and Goebbels and Bormann vehemently opposing the book. When Papen thought he had convinced Hitler, Bormann would succeed in changing Hitler's mind. In the end, only 2,000 copies would be printed and handed out only to high-ranking officials. Hudal was devastated and never recovered. The Vatican threatened to put Foundations of National Socialism on the prohibited books list, a first time ever for a bishop to be on the list. After the war, he was sent to an isolated monastery. In the opening of the book, there is a quote from Soviet Vyacheslav Molotov that said the greatest threat to Bolshevik expansion would be an alliance between the Catholic and fascist internationals. In 1936, Adolf Hitler met with Michael Faulhaber, Archbishop of Munich and Freising. Faulhaber was one of the fiercest critics of National Socialist ideology. In the past, when asked to hand over a list of converted Jews, he refused. He also expressed disdain over Rosenberg's myth of the 20th century. Hitler spoke for nearly an hour, warning the Archbishop that if National Socialism didn't rule over Bolshevism, then Christianity and the Church in Europe would disappear. Hitler also provided him with a list of 380 priests who were public critics of the Reich and told him the Church needed to end its trivial differences to survive against Bolshevism. Faulhaber in the past referred to Bolshevism as the greatest affliction of our time and did not need convincing of the dangers of the ideology. Faulhaber then said the Church was willing to obey the laws as long as they didn't violate fundamental principles, and if they did, they should be able to speak about it. Faulhaber said the party had been at war with the Church for 3 years and that radicals in the party were calling for the eradication of Christianity. Hitler told Faulhaber,
When there is peace between National Socialism and the Church, this will all stop. We have nothing to do with this movement. I have always told my political party chiefs that I do not want to play the role of religious reformer. I do not want to do that, and I will not do that.
They argued for 3 more hours until Hitler finally said,
Herr Cardinal, you should speak to the other leaders of the Church and consider in which way you will support the great task of nationalism not to allow Bolshevism to reign, and how you will come to a peaceful relationship to the state. Either National Socialism and the Church will be victorious, or they will both be destroyed. I am telling you, I will remove all the small things that intervene in peaceful cooperation, like the trials against priests and the German religious movement. I don't want to engage in horse trading. You know that I am an enemy of compromise, but it should be a last attempt.
In a more solemn tone, he then told Faulhaber that one day they would all die, and that every individual is nothing, and that this makes one introspective and humble before God. The 2 men then had a quiet lunch, and later Faulhaber would write in a confidential memorandum that he was convinced Hitler was a man of serious spiritual conviction. In the next year, March of 1937, Pope Pius XI issues an encyclical called With Burning Concern. The encyclical condemned breaches of the Concordat. It condemned pantheistic confusion, neo-paganism, and defended the Old Testament. It reads, "Whoever exalts race or the people or the state, or a particular form of state, or the depositories of power, or any other fundamental value of the human community, however necessary and honorable be their function in worldly things, whoever raises these notions above their standard value and divinizes them to an idolatrous level, distorts and perverts an order of the world planned and created by God, he is far from the true faith in God and from the concept of life which that faith upholds." Did Hitler divinize and idolize race? Let's rewind back to 1933, when Hitler had a conversation with Wilhelm Berning, a Roman Catholic bishop of Osnabrück and a member of the Prussian State Council appointed by Hermann Göring.
I was attacked because of the way I handled the Jewish issue. The Catholic Church considered the Jews pestilential for 1500 years and placed them in ghettos because it recognized the Jews for what they were. In the era of liberalism, the danger was no longer recognized. I do not place race above religion, but I recognize the representatives of this race as pestilent to the state and the Church. And perhaps I am doing a great service to Christianity.
It is clear the Catholic Church did not fully grasp National Socialist doctrine through the fog of foreign propaganda and the loud pagan minority. In a speech in Berlin in 1939, Hitler would say,
The National Socialist state has not closed even one single church, neither prevented church services nor infringed on the conduct of masses. It has not imposed its views on any confession's church doctrine and faith. In the National Socialist state, man is free to seek absolution in the fashion desired. However, the National Socialist state will relentlessly deal with those priests who, instead of serving the Lord, see their mission in propagating derisive comments on our present Reich, its institutions, or its leading men. It will bring to their attention the fact that the destruction of this state will not be tolerated. It must, however, be stated at this point that there are thousands upon thousands of priests of all Christian beliefs who attend to their clerical duties in a manner infinitely superior to these clerical warmongers and without entering into conflict with the established law and order. To protect these is the mission of the state. To destroy the enemies of the state is the duty of the state.
Approximately 17,000 Catholic priests and seminarians would be conscripted into the Wehrmacht between 1939 and 1945. In 1933, the NSDAP attempted to unify the Protestant churches by creating a Reich Church, similar to the Church of England. A set of ideological propositions was issued called the 28 Theses, drafted by theologians Joachim Hossenfelder and Siegfried Nack, aimed to synthesize Christian doctrine with National Socialist principles. Chaplain Ludwig Müller was then appointed as Reich Bishop. The 28 Theses asserted that the Church exists within the state, not above it as Catholic, or below as the Old Church, but true to the vision of Martin Luther. A concordat would not be needed as the Church exists within the state. The Reich Church would not allow mixed-race marriages, but would also not view Christians from other races as lesser Christians, but different Christians. The Reich Church would be uniquely German. The Old Testament would not be viewed with the same value as the New Testament due to ties with Judaism, but remains important as it describes the decline of the Jew. Since Jesus was not a wearer of human nature, but of the nature of God, thus the argument whether Jesus was a Jew or not is invalid. The Reich Church defines positive Christianity as faith in Christ, salvation through Christ, and actions inspired by Christ. A controversial point in the theses was Thesis 3, called the Arian paragraph, that said only Arians can be members of the Reich Church. The confessing church would then emerge in opposition to the German Christians and their adoption of the Arian paragraph. In 1933, Martin Niemöller formed the Pastors' Emergency League to oppose the Arian paragraph by signing a pledge rejecting it. Over 2,000 pastors signed the pledge due to viewing the paragraph as a violation of Christian confession, particularly because it excluded baptized Christians of Jewish descent, undermining the principle that baptism makes all believers equal. This resistance crystallized into the Confessing Church. The Confessing Church formed in 1934, led by Martin Niemöller, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and Karl Barth. They rejected NSDAP interference in church doctrine and governance. The church's foundational document was the Barmen Declaration, primarily authored by Barth, asserting that Christ alone is the authority of the church, not the state or racial ideologies like the Arian paragraph. The declaration condemned the German Christians' alignment with NSDAP policies as heretical, emphasizing that the church's allegiance was to Scripture, not the Führer. Due to the failure of Müller to unite Protestants, he was sidelined, and Hans Kerl was appointed head of the newly established Reich Ministry for Church Affairs. Müller would serve in his position until his death in 1945, but his power was diminished. Kerl, on the other hand, was not a church official, but a politician with a legal background. He was tasked with what Müller failed to do. Kerl's efforts to unify the churches eventually also failed, as the divide between the German Christians and the Confessing Church deepened. By 1937, the Confessing Church's resistance, including public protests, undermined his authority. Kerl sought to enforce National Socialist policies indirectly through administrative measures, such as controlling church finances, restricting sermons, and pressuring clergy to comply with state directives. He issued decrees limiting church publications and activities, aiming to weaken the Confessing Church's influence. From 1935 to 1936, 700 Confessing Church pastors were arrested. After 1937, Kerl's influence waned and his health started to decline. He would later die in 1941. In 1933, there were approximately only 20 to 30,000 Jehovah's Witnesses in Germany. They were referred to as Bible students, but recently changed their name to Jehovah's Witnesses internationally in 1931. Jehovah's Witnesses were one of the first religious groups banned by the National Socialists in 1933. Unlike Catholics and Protestants, who often navigated a complex relationship with the regime through cooperation or selective resistance, Jehovah's Witnesses were unrelenting in their refusal to swear allegiance to Hitler, perform military service due to strict adherence to pacifism, or participate in rituals, such as the Hitler greeting. This stemmed from their belief in strict neutrality and their view that loyalty was owed solely to God's kingdom, not earthly governments. It is estimated that 10 to 12,000 Jehovah's Witnesses were imprisoned, and 2 to 5,000 were put in concentration camps, where they were marked by a purple badge. By the late 1930s, Hitler would become less interested with church affairs, focusing more on war preparations. Church matters were increasingly handled by more radical officials like Martin Bormann. In the next chapter, we will discuss a man who attempted to blow the whistle on both the neo-pagan infiltration into the party and radicals in the party who were creating religious division. Dr. Caius Fabricius was a professor of theology and an NSDAP party member. Fabricius was a strong proponent of Point 24, and in 1935, with the blessing of Adolf Hitler, published a work entitled Positive Christianity in the Third Reich to dispel rumors that National Socialism was an anti-Christian ideology. In the treatise, he makes the argument that after Hitler took power, Christianity has flourished, and the party still affirmed the standpoint of positive Christianity. Adolf Hitler, its Führer and Chancellor, has repeatedly affirmed the party program, especially the main clause relating to positive Christianity. This was particularly the case in the three notable speeches made by him in the year 1934, namely on January 30th, August 17th and 26th. On these three solemn occasions, the Führer stated in words that left no doubt as to their meaning that National Socialism affirmed positive Christianity. Moreover, as a further explanation of his statement, Adolf Hitler declared that by positive Christianity, he meant the Christianity of the two great churches, the Evangelical and the Roman Catholic, both of which are represented in Germany. At the same time, however, he made it perfectly plain that he had nothing in common with people in bearskins, with those namely who, recalling the old Germanic tribes, would foist neo-pagan cult experiments upon the German folk. Fabricius expands further on neo-pagans by writing, "And if there should still be a few individuals in Germany today who, with regard to this point, prefer to swim in the old channel of the last era, scoffing at priests and devout people after the manner of Marxist freethinkers, looking askance at anyone professing to be a Christian, then it is a sign that such people have not yet grasped the significance of the new era and are rather to be considered as a grave menace to the peace and inner strength of the German folk." But in passing, another misconception must be removed. This refers to the relationship between Christianity and Judaism. Long before the rise of National Socialism, there were certain national literary circles amongst the intelligentsia of the upper middle classes of pre-war days who, for the sake of their German nationality, believed it necessary to reject Christianity as being historically connected with Judaism. On the appearance of National Socialism and its attacks on the Jewish supremacy in our Volk, these intelligentsia thought the moment had arrived for a similar attack on Christianity. This point of view is definitely rejected by the clause referred to in the party program, and it is unnecessary to examine it further here. Besides, it is clear that the spirit of the Christian faith has nothing to do with the Judaism we National Socialists are combating. In 1938, Fabricius then published a confidential work, not for public dissemination, called The Reich in Struggle. Fabricius attempted to address the growing religious infighting on the rise in the party and how neo-pagans are forming a party within the party. The old German hereditary sin of mutual slander among German brothers is bearing strong fruit again once more, especially under slogans such as alien worldview and native worldview. People are fighting with each other with the same malice as before, creating divisions within the nation that run at least as deep as the former class conflicts. This party rejects point 24 of the NSDAP program. It does not support the position of positive Christianity, but rather advocates for free-thinking heroism. It abandons the fight against Jewish materialism and the notion of inner renewal, as it promotes nationalistic and materialistic ideas itself. It also does not recognize the freedom of religious expression, treating Christian compatriots as second-class citizens and insulting and opposing Christian churches. It is difficult to determine the exact leadership of this party. Some attribute it to Rosenberg, but this is likely incorrect. One of the leading figures, and increasingly sole leader, appears to be Frau Ludendorff. Fabricius affirms that Mathilde Ludendorff, whose organization Hitler forbid party members from joining, have infiltrated the party and are pushing her theory that Christianity is a Jewish scheme. In 1937, the Ludendorffs started a new organization called the Bund für Deutsche Gotterkenntnis, or Association for German Knowledge of God. Fabricius also writes about the Black Corps publishing an article, To the Churches, where it said that the state religion is the promotion of what is natural and combats what is against nature. He writes of the infiltration into the Hitler Youth, which was supposed to be neutral on religion. Hitler had a similar sentiment during a conversation with Otto Wagner and Hans Schem, where he said,
"The rubbish the paganists dredge up from prehistory, then they read Nietzsche with 15-year-old boys."
On that note, let's talk about Friedrich Nietzsche. While Hitler did admire Nietzsche's concept of willpower, and the National Socialists superficially adopted the concept of the Superman, the National Socialists did so in a more racial way, as Nietzsche was a philo-Semite. This is obviously not compatible with National Socialism. According to his own writings, Nietzsche would not be happy being associated with National Socialism in any way. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche writes, "Let no more Jews come in and shut the doors, especially towards the east, also towards Austria. Thus commands the instinct of a people whose nature is still feeble and uncertain, so that it could be easily wiped out, easily extinguished by a stronger race. The Jews, however, are beyond a doubt the strongest, toughest, and purest race at present living in Europe. They know how to succeed, even under the worst conditions." The purest race? In Nietzsche's unpublished fragments from the period of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he writes, "The Jews are the oldest and purest race in Europe. That's why the beauty of Jewish women is unsurpassed." Also in Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche says that the Jews are not trying to control Europe. It is certain that the Jews, if they desired, or if they were driven to it, as the anti-Semites seem to wish, could now have the ascendancy, nay, literally the supremacy over Europe. That they are not working, and planning for that end is equally certain. He would go on to say, "It would perhaps be useful and fair to banish the anti-Semitic ballers out of the country." Nietzsche even put the Jews over his own family. In a letter to his sister, he writes that he is tired of being confused as an anti-Semite and lumped in with other anti-Semites as his brother-in-law, Bernhard Forster. He writes a letter to her disowning her over her husband's views on the Jews. "Now it is gone so far that I have to defend myself tooth and nail against those who confuse me with these anti-Semitic rabble. After my own sister, my former sister, has given the impetus to this most disastrous of all confusions. I am now in a state of self-defense against the party of your husband." Nietzsche even had correspondence with one of Hitler's biggest influences, Theodor Fritsch. In a return letter in 1887, Nietzsche writes, "Herewith I am returning to you the 3 issues of your correspondence sheet, yet I ask in the future to not provide me with these anti-Semitic mailings. I fear, in the end, for my patience." He ends the letter with, "And finally, how do you think I feel when the name Zarathustra is mouthed by anti-Semites? Yours most sincerely, Dr. Friedrich Nietzsche." Hitler would have this to say about Nietzsche.
I can't really do much with Nietzsche. He is more an artist than a philosopher. He doesn't have the crystal-clear understanding of Schopenhauer. Of course, I value Nietzsche as a genius. He writes possibly the most beautiful language that German literature has to offer us today, but he is not my guide.
2 biographers of Nietzsche believed him to be a homosexual, and Nietzsche died of complications of syphilis, a disease he most likely obtained from a brothel at the age of 23. Now let's get back to Fabricius. Fabricius then writes that Victor Lutze, the SA Chief of Staff, gave guidelines called Cultural Service Planning that was picked up by the American media and disseminated to the American public. Of this matter, he writes, "Now it has been irrefutably established abroad that neo-paganism rules in Germany. All attempts to prove the contrary by distributing literature abroad are, therefore, fruitless for the time being. This will undoubtedly have consequences for foreign policy as well." Fabricius affirms that Germany is still overwhelmingly Christian, and not many people have left the churches, despite efforts of the neo-pagans. He also writes that although trust in the party may be diminished due to the neo-pagan subversion, trust in Hitler is unshaken. He hopes that Hitler will be informed of the gravity of the situation and take swift action. In 1939, Fabricius writes a confidential memorandum called Inner Armor. Germany is now at war, but Fabricius writes that this memorandum and call to fix the religious division in Germany cannot wait until after the war. He writes, "Even during the movement's struggle years, these circles caused trouble for the Führer, and the Führer successfully worked to keep the movement free from the dominance of their influence. This led to bitter hostility from a particularly extreme group led by Frau Ludendorff, whose association was soon banned after the takeover of power. The radicals among us differ from foreign freethinkers only in that they call their ideas German, Aryan, folkish, Nordic, emphasize blood in human nature, and call the unrepentant attitude heroic, while rejecting everything they don't like as Jewish, even though their worldview is influenced by Jewish materialism and is far removed from the instincts of the Aryan race." Fabricius goes on to say that a number of the neo-pagans or German believers are disguised Marxists who have ties to the international freethinker movement. He writes that there was a meeting in Bohemia in the spring of 1934 where the members took credit for the spread of the German faith movement that was sowing division in Germany. He describes these infiltrators as minuscule in numbers but powerful. They seek to infiltrate the highest leadership to create an anti-Christian and free-thinking leadership class. They operate both openly and in the shadows, while blending personal and official roles. Opposing them, he writes, will get someone declared as an enemy of the state. 2 months after the dissemination of the memorandum, Fabricius was arrested in Breslau and eventually was declared an enemy of the state. In his notes while imprisoned, he writes about his attempts to limit his detention, fearing that if word gets out to the public or abroad, it will further the propaganda of the enemy that the NSDAP was persecuting Christians. He claims that his offenses against the state have never been presented to him and he was confused as to why he was arrested. He writes that the memorandum was received without objection by the agencies to which it was addressed. Dr. Meissner, the chief of the presidential chancellery, acknowledged the receipt and forwarded it to the Council of Ministers. The Minister of Education's adjutant sent a note of thanks acknowledging the receipt of the document. The Berlin Reich Church administration approved and gave a strong endorsement of the memorandum. Even the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces sent an adjutant to the residence of Fabricius, saying that the department shared his position. A month later, he sent a copy to the Ministry of Propaganda, where it was confiscated and Fabricius was interrogated. He says that during the interrogation, no political offense was found against him. He was released and called back the next day for a supplementary interrogation. Here it was recorded that Fabricius received no rejections, but rather endorsements from various parties. Fabricius thought the matter was over, but he was arrested days later by order of Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS. In a 1940 letter to Reich Minister Dr. Lammers, Fabricius writes that he was expelled from the party without prior proceedings by Reichsleiters Philipp Bauer and Rudolf Hess. Although he was released from custody, he was to refrain from political activity under threat of lifelong imprisonment in a concentration camp, and he could not leave Berlin without permission from the state. He ends the letter with Heil Hitler and his signature. In 1946, after the war, Fabricius describes the circumstances of his arrest in 2 affidavits at Nuremberg. His story does not change. He says that during the National Socialist era, there was religious infighting, but it was not caused by the state or the party, but by neo-pagans such as Mathilde Ludendorff and German novelist Gustav Frenssen. He once again writes of the Freethinker meeting in 1934, but here he gives the whole quote of what was said at the meeting: "We have been politically destroyed in Germany, but not ideologically. The German faith movement, that is us, that is our work." He then names high party officials that were fomenting the religious struggle, such as Heinrich Himmler, Robert Ley, and Martin Bormann. He writes that they were acting contrary to the positions of Adolf Hitler, and includes quotes of the party program, Mein Kampf, and Hitler's speeches. Even though this was after the war, not one negative word of Hitler is written in the affidavits of Fabricius. In the next chapter, we will see if the accusations made by Fabricius against certain party members has any credibility. Martin Bormann was head of the NSDAP Chancellery and Hitler's private secretary. His position gave him significant control over access to the Führer. Bormann managed Hitler's schedule, correspondence and communications, effectively deciding who could meet with him, what information reached him, and which documents or proposals were prioritized. This position allowed Bormann to filter and shape the flow of information, making him a powerful intermediary between Hitler and other party leaders, government officials, or external parties. Bormann was a staunch anti-cleric. While Hitler took a more pragmatic approach to get the churches in line with the state, Bormann was more overzealous in his actions. On several occasions, Hitler intervened to curb Bormann's policies. In 1941, when Bormann's orders to remove crucifixes from Bavarian schools sparked significant protests, Hitler personally ordered the policy to be rescinded to avoid further unrest. Similarly, Bormann sent a circular to party officials saying National Socialism and Christianity were incompatible. Hitler ordered an immediate retraction and recollection of the circulars already sent out. Martin Bormann's supposed notes compiled between 1941 to 1944 of monologues and conversations attributed to Adolf Hitler was first published as a book called Hitler's Table Talk in 1953. Both academia and revisionists have built on the rotten foundation of this book for decades, without a second thought to historical accuracy or reverence to Hitler's legacy. Here are 2 quotes from the book, attributed to Hitler.
The best thing is to let Christianity die a natural death. When understanding of the universe has become widespread, when the majority of men know that the stars are not sources of light, but worlds, perhaps inhabited worlds like ours, then the Christian doctrine will be convicted of absurdity. Christianity has reached the peak of absurdity in this respect, and that's why, sooner or later, it will have to disappear.
And the next quote.
The heaviest blow that ever struck humanity was the coming of Christianity. We'll see to it that the churches cannot spread abroad teachings in conflict with the interests of the state. We shall continue to preach the doctrine of National Socialism, and the young will no longer be taught anything but the truth.
Let us break down why this post-war published book is problematic and should not be seen as the verbatim words of Hitler. Heinrich Heim and Henry Picker, both National Socialist lawyers, were key figures involved in recording the conversations that became Hitler's table talk. Both were not skilled in stenography, the practice of writing in shorthand, to quickly transcribe spoken words or information, often used by court reporters or secretaries. This is required if you want to claim that Hitler's speech was accurately recorded. In court, Picker openly admitted that both of them were not stenographers. He said, "We were lawyers, not stenographers. No original source notes even exist, but merely copies." Revisionist David Irving admitted that François Genoux, who first had control over the original Bormann notes, was in possession of ribbon copies. What does original mean? Heim's process had several steps. First, he typed up a version based on jotted down words from his memory. Then he made his own changes, called proof pages. We are already 3 or 4 steps removed from Hitler's words, whatever they may have been. Heim then typed up 3 copies, arbitrarily calling one copy the original for Bormann's own use. These copies of his own edited notes based off single-word memories were then filed at party headquarters in Munich. The proof pages were discovered in the Library of Congress in the 1950s, but would not be examined until 2015. This examination put the validity of the other manuscripts into serious question. These handwritten changes show that the notes are a carefully crafted literary product, where Heim, assisted by Bormann, made an effort to formulate the statements ascribed to Hitler in, according to their view, the best possible manner. Meaning, these are not the thoughts and words of Hitler. In a note in 1942, Pickler says that Bormann was inserting phrases during editorial meetings of the notes. He writes, "They are not even honest and have hypocritical words. Bormann, whose underlying confrontation with the churches it fit excellently into, wanted to have heard it while I hadn't heard it." Oddly enough, this quote is also in Table Talk and attributed to Hitler. This quote is in 1941, the same year as the other 2 supposed quotes from Hitler.
Originally, Christianity was merely an incarnation of Bolshevism, the destroyer. Nevertheless, the Galilean, who later was called the Christ, intended something quite different. He must be regarded as a popular leader who took up his position against Jewry. Galilee was a colony where the Romans had probably installed Gallic legionaries, and it's certain that Jesus was not a Jew.
Even in the so-called best evidence that Hitler was anti-Christian, it still has Hitler saying that he believes Jesus to be an Aryan fighter against the Jews. There are theories that Bormann was a Soviet spy who leaked secrets causing Germany to lose the war, and that he even lived in Moscow afterwards. He was accused of this by SS generals at Nuremberg. Others contend that Bormann received an undeserved negative reputation. Dr. Friedrich Bergold, who was appointed to represent Bormann in absentia at Nuremberg, displayed evidence that Bormann was not persecuting Christians. When his client was accused of prohibiting priests from holding high party offices, Bergold argued that atheist countries like the Soviet Union would do the same. Bergold argued that church publications weren't the only publications that had restrictions, but restrictions were placed on all publications due to wartime paper shortages. Also, the churches had still received government subsidies until the end of the war. A Soviet spy who fled to Moscow, or killed while fleeing the Führer bunker in May of 1945. These are deep rabbit holes within themselves. What is clear is that Bormann was obviously anti-clerical, leaning on anti-Christian, and he did things counter to the wishes of Hitler in regards to Christianity. Joseph Goebbels, like Hitler, was raised Catholic and also had aspirations of one day being a priest. In early adulthood, due to personal crises and intellectual pursuits, he began to question Catholicism. Goebbels would join the party in 1924, embracing the worldview of the NSDAP. He would go on to view the Catholic Church as corrupt, and in 1935 would launch the Morality Trials. The Morality Trials were a series of highly publicized legal proceedings aimed at Catholic clergy and some Protestants. These trials accused priests and religious figures of moral and sexual misconduct, such as homosexuality, pedophilia, or other immoral behaviors, to portray the Catholic Church as corrupt and hypocritical. By 1937, Hitler grew tired of the Goebbels morality trials. As shown previously in the conversation with Archbishop Faulhaber, Hitler was willing to end them if the Catholic Church and National Socialism could reach an agreement. After the publishing of the encyclical of Pope Pius, Hitler would temporarily halt the more overtly aggressive actions against the churches. A portion of Goebbels' diary was published in 1978, and the rest in 1993. The diaries were in the hands of the Soviets from 1945 to 1992. In a December 1939 entry, Goebbels writes, "The Führer is deeply religious, though completely anti-Christian. He views Christianity as a symptom of decay. Rightly so. It is a branch of the Jewish race." From what you have heard so far, does this sound like something Hitler would say? Or was Goebbels simply hearing what he wanted to hear, as Bormann did? Or perhaps Hitler is expressing a deep frustration due to battles with the Catholic Church. Either way, it is a diary, and not the official words of Hitler. Also, this is the man who translated Goebbels' diary into English. Joseph Goebbels saw the NSDAP as actually putting Christianity into action. In a speech, he would have this to say: "If someone from an opposing party has something against us, it is, 'You are pagans.' I can only respond, 'How so? Do we act like pagans? Is it pagan to organize a winter relief and to thereby feed millions of people? Is it pagan to give a people its inner peace back? Is it pagan to help one's poor brother and neighbor? Is it pagan to restore the ethic of the family? And is it pagan to give the worker a purpose in life? And is it pagan to rebuild a state of moral principles, to drive out atheism, to cleanse theater and film of the contamination and poison of Jewish liberal Marxism? Is that pagan? If that's pagan, then we certainly give thanks for a Christianity that did the opposite. The churches say, it's in your program that you religiously stand on positive Christian ground. But we would like to wish that the churches would, like how we are religiously positive Christian, to be politically positive National Socialistic. In that case, we are united. Then nothing will separate us anymore." After the beer hall putsch, Rudolf Hess came out of hiding and surrendered to the authorities, so he could be imprisoned alongside Adolf Hitler. Hess would help Hitler with the writing of Mein Kampf. The imprisonment strengthened their bond, and Hess would become eternally loyal to Hitler.
Ich schwöre Adolf Hitler. Unerschütterliche Treue.
In 1936, Hess was diagnosed with latent paranoid schizophrenia, which would be kept secret for obvious reasons. When the war began, Hitler immediately made Hess second in line to succeed him. Hitler, not wanting to fight against the British, asked Hess to reach out to his friend, the Duke of Hamilton, to see if the war could be stopped. Hess would take this mission more seriously than anyone thought. Hess began having visions and nightmares of dead children's coffins in Germany and Britain, with their mothers weeping behind them. He was tormented by these visions and convinced himself he needed to take drastic actions. Hess, a trained pilot, decided he would secretly fly a plane to Scotland, to speak personally with the Duke of Hamilton in order to achieve a peace deal between Britain and Germany. Before leaving, he asked his astrologer what would be the best day to fly. The astrologer told him Sunday, May 10th, 1941. Hess told his family he would be back Monday, but would not see them again until 28 years later. Hess's plane would run out of fuel during the flight. He parachuted out and landed, breaking his ankle, 10 miles from the Duke's house. A local farmer discovered him and alerted authorities. Hess was arrested and became a prisoner of war. Hitler was enraged when he learned of what Hess had done. When it was found out, he went to an astrologer. Operation Hess would be launched. Operation Hess involved the arrest and detention of hundreds of occult practitioners, confiscation of occult literature, and the prohibition of many groups and individuals involved in these practices. Reinhard Heydrich, head of the security services, would organize the Hess operation. Heydrich had experience in dealing with occultists. He first became head of the SS intelligence agency in 1932 under Heinrich Himmler. He would gather intelligence against enemies of National Socialists, such as Freemasons. In 1934, the National Socialists outlawed Freemasonry in Germany, and by 1935 all Masonic lodges were dissolved. Heydrich's agency played a key role in enforcing it by monitoring and suppressing Masonic activities. On June 4, 1941, Heydrich sent a message to all regional governors in the Third Reich, instructing them to prepare for an action against occult teachings. Heydrich would write a 9-page order that said, "The German people can no longer be exposed to occult teachings which claim that man's actions and omissions are dependent on mysterious magical powers. The strictest immediate measures must therefore be taken against these teachings and sciences." Albert Hartl, head of the Ideological Opponents Group, would coordinate the operation. Hartl was a former Catholic priest who left the priesthood to become an SS officer. The targets of the operation were anthroposophists, theosophists, ariosophists, astrologers, parapsychologists, fortune tellers, faith healers, rune readers, and many others who practice occultism. A number of occultists were arrested and imprisoned, some being sent to concentration camps. Rudolf Hess died on August 17, 1987, at Spandau Prison in West Berlin, Germany. He was found hanged in a garden shed at the prison, where he had been serving a life sentence since his conviction at the Nuremberg trials in 1946. His death was officially ruled a suicide, though some theories suggest otherwise. In 1937, Hess gave a speech to the officers of the Wehrmacht National Political Training Course. He said, "We are convinced that our faith in God and our Christianity stand up better to hard trials than the faith and Christianity of those who often adhere only to formalities. We consider ourselves to be better Christians than those who only meaningfully pronounce the words of Christ, and we do not intend to found new churches. We respect the church, but we demand for our state what belongs to him." Himmler often professed anti-Christian ideas, saying things such as, "The guideline for us in our struggle is neither the Old nor the New Testament, but the political testament of Adolf Hitler." And in a private speech to the SS in Berlin, he said, "We must finish with Christianity." This second quote is often taken out of context to mean Germany as a whole, but it was really directed at SS officers in secret. Himmler also had a particular dislike for the Catholic Church and called it a homosexual erotic men's league. Himmler had a strong conception of ancestor worship, which wasn't always Germanic in origin. He believed in a sort of reincarnation through your children, which was a mix of Christian values and Eastern religious ideas. Himmler also studied the Bhagavad Gita, claiming it had great Aryan qualities, the Eddas, the Vedas and Rig Veda's Buddha, and the Visuddhimagga. Himmler believed in an omnipotent God that he never actually defined. In 1935, he professed belief in a Lord God who stands over us, who made us and our fatherland, our folk and the earth, and sent us our Führer. Note that this would exclude the Nordic gods, as none of them are described as omnipotent or omnipresent. The wording also seems to be in the vein of the traditional Christian God. Himmler had a deep fascination with King Heinrich I, or Henry the Fowler. Himmler celebrated the 1000th anniversary of his death at Quedlinburg Cathedral in 1936 and was so enthralled with this medieval figure that he believed himself to be Heinrich's reincarnation. Himmler often referenced the idea of turning the SS into an order similar to the Teutonic Knights, a Christian order of crusaders. It is much more accurate to say that the structure and symbols of the SS were influenced by medieval knights and not Germanic paganism. The castle that housed the Black Sun was meant to invoke these Christian warrior societies whose purpose was to protect Christianity, not advocate for Wotan. Himmler was a follower of Hans Horbiger's occultism. Horbiger put forth the pseudoscientific concept of world ice theory, in which world history was a struggle between ice and fire, linking the flood of Genesis and the destruction of the Teutonic kingdom of Atlantis to gravitational catastrophes supposedly unleashed when the Earth captured a moon in its orbit. Technically, Hans Horbiger was a Christian as well, but a very unorthodox one. Hitler and Rosenberg were no fan of Horbiger's work. Rosenberg sent a circular to all NSDAP offices to assure them that adherence to these theories was no part of being a National Socialist. Himmler reacted to this rejection by telling his SS men that no polemics against Horbiger's theories would be tolerated. Though Himmler was interested in Germanic mythology, he never mentioned Wotan or our modern concept of Odinistic heathenism in any speeches or correspondence. Also, there is no known official use of the Black Sun, Schwarze Sonne, in the Third Reich on tanks, SS or Wehrmacht uniforms or government buildings. The only known example is Himmler's private Wewelsburg castle. Felix Kirsten, his personal physician, noted that Himmler was particularly superstitious, had an interest in astrology, though he doesn't believe it to be true, and was afraid of an invisible power to which he would one day give an account to himself, which sounds very Christian. Kirsten confirmed that Himmler was antagonist of the Catholic Church. Kirsten also remarked that there are not many men in the SS with whom he can seriously discuss these topics, meaning his interest in non-Christian religions. Himmler seemed to be brainstorming ideas with university professors and Germanic scholars instead of SS Gruppenführers and Obergruppenführers. Other members of the party were starting to take note of Himmler's erratic and chaotic mix of beliefs. According to Albert Speer, the whole thing was beginning to assume far-fetched pseudo-religious forms. Goebbels, with Hitler, took the lead in ridiculing these dreams of Himmler's, with Himmler himself adding to the comedy by his vanity and obsessiveness. Hitler and Himmler disagreed on the importance of ancient Germanic history. Hitler would say,
"Isn't it enough that the Romans were erecting great buildings when our forefathers were still living in mud huts? Now, Himmler is starting to dig up these villages of mud huts and enthusing over every potsherd and stone axe he finds."
Hitler finally approached Himmler himself in 1935, fully rejecting the foundation of a new religion, calling it a chimera or an illusory fantasy. In a 1937 memorandum marked to all SS leaders from Standartenführer up, Himmler instructed, "In ideological training, I forbid every attack against Christ as a person, since such attacks or insults that Christ was a Jew are unworthy of us and certainly untrue historically." Himmler added that this order was to be enforced on pain of expulsion from the organization of the SS. Himmler's secretary, Rudolf Brandt, once received a letter from a young member of the Hitler Youth. The young boy wrote to the Reichsführer SS asking if he was to believe a lecturer who put forth the idea that Jesus was a Jew. Rudolf Brandt replied, "The Reichsführer SS, Himmler, is of the conviction that Jesus was not a Jew. You must have misunderstood the speaker." This is also confirmed in Himmler's response to Ernest Renan's book, Life of Jesus, where he said, "He proves to me by his whole book that Jesus was no Jew, and that Christianity was and is the most important protest of the Aryans against the Jews, of good against evil." Himmler also had a deep respect for his own family's Christian observance, and he would later take this to a degree where his own close associates questioned how sincerely anti-Christian he truly was. Was Himmler planning to secretly eradicate Christianity? Evidence suggests he was not attempting to. Again, he said to his private physician, "Everything is still in a state of flux. We're struggling towards a final form of belief. You can expect mature men to take part in this struggle and to share the dangers of having no fixed creed. But it's not right to root children up from their familiar world and make them face the problems of faith before they're fully grown. Let them keep to the old ways so long as the old order survives. They'll come across it every day when they're playing with their friends. Once they're grown up, they can decide for themselves. Faith has to grow of its own accord. You can only clear the way for it, not dictate it. This ambiguity also echoes sentiments he made about the SS man. As you know, personally I have chosen to leave the church, but I do not wish for this to become a sport for lower-level leaders. I would rather have a Sturm in which only 10% have left, with the remaining 90% remaining just as good National Socialists. To me, it is truly preferable if someone takes 1, 2, or 5 years to leave the church, thus leaving it out of true conviction, than for someone to follow a fashion and do it only externally. Again, to his physician, Himmler would say, "I've nothing against Christianity in itself. No doubt it has lofty moral ideals. But we have to be on our guard against a world power which makes use of Christianity and its organization to oppose our own national resurrection by methods of which we're everywhere conscious." He would then say that Jewish power was already removed from Germany, and after the war, Catholic priests who meddle in politics will be unfrocked, and neither God nor the Virgin Mary will save them. Kirsten then said, "But you're surely not opposed to the Virgin Mary, Herr Reichsführer?" Himmler replied, "No, not at all. To link womanhood with religion is a noble idea. It suits our Germanic outlook. In ancient Rome it was virgins, the Vestals, who guarded the sacred flame in the Temple of Vesta, and many peoples used to honor their wise women. I'm very touched myself when I see how women and children bring their troubles to the Virgin Mary." In 1992, an interview was conducted with Himmler's daughter Gudrun. She was asked, "What was your father's view regarding religion and Christianity? History tells us he was an occultist and worked to destroy the church and persecute Christians." She would respond,
"You certainly have read enough of the victor's version of our history. This is somewhat hard to explain to someone who is not German, but I will try. My father had a vision of a people turning back to their creator, who gave us everything we know. Our people, the Europeans, have created all the great civilizations, have set foot on every continent, and have brought great good to the whole world. We are leaps and bounds ahead of any other peoples, including the advanced Orientals. My father asked the questions as to why, where, and how. He commissioned studies of our history to trace the footsteps of our ancestors. Where did they originate, and why were they so intelligent and advanced when other races stayed the same? The SS idea was to turn our people back to their roots, from where they came and away from the modern Judeo-Church, whom was seen as a destructive Trojan horse to weaken the people and turn them from their God. The German Christians were a good start, and my father attended many services by pastors who understood the Jewish influence on the Christian religion was not a good thing and led to false teachings. Therefore, my father respected the church. Many SS officers were Catholic, and he had no wish to anger Christians.
We will end with an entry in Himmler's diary from 1919. He wrote, "Come what may, I shall always love God, shall pray to him, and shall remain faithful to the Catholic Church, and shall defend it, even if I should be expelled from it." In the same way that the NSDAP viewed themselves as the true socialists, without the Jewish-infused Marxism, the founders and visionaries of National Socialism viewed themselves as the progenitors of a true Christianity, without what they felt was Jewish corruption or church doctrine that was hindering preserving race and the fatherland. In no way was Adolf Hitler looking to form a new religion based on ancient Germanic paganism, or have his people look to him as divine. As Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf,
"The Jew's life is truly only of this world, and his soul is, for example, just as intimately alien to the true Christianity as his essence was to the high founder, Christ, of the new teachings 2,000 years ago."
Is it that unreasonable to think that the NSDAP followed and stayed true to point 24 of the party program? the program that Hitler said was fixed and immovable. That sought to combat the Jewish materialist spirit within us and without us. Were Catholic priests or Protestant pastors imprisoned for being subversives to the nation? Yes, as they should have been for not adhering to the laws of the nation that they were operating in. This does not mean that Adolf Hitler was going to eradicate the religion of Christianity due to struggles with the churches. The concept of race first is ideal if it means prioritizing race purely in politics. But if it is used as a wedge or lever to separate us from Christ, we will fail, and it's against our own interests. If one chooses to not be Christian or to be pagan, it is fine as long as it does not militate against unity. If one, however, chooses to become a vocal antichrist, they have crossed a sacred line and must be eradicated from any movement or cause. History does not repeat itself in the same way, but there are reoccurring themes. Today, Europeans are dealing with the same minuscule but loud minority that seeks to tear Europeans away from Christianity. They are traitors and should be treated as such. They are not open to inner renewal and thus are a danger to our people. A traitor is far worse than an enemy. Identity is a mix of blood, soil, and heaven. If one is taken away, the entire structure will collapse. If one calls themselves a National Socialist, they should honor Adolf Hitler by not only living the National Socialist worldview, but by learning and telling the truth about the founder, not parroting the propaganda of the victors to suit their own selfish worldview. They should speak in reverence and tell the truth of the boy who would put an apron around his shoulders and deliver long sermons, aspiring to be a priest to the delight of his devout Catholic mother. The same boy who gazed at the hooked cross in a monastery that ignited grand aspirations within him. To the man and struggling artist who would produce a work of art called Mother Mary with the Holy Child Jesus Christ, and then a year later, fight bravely in World War I. To the man who was blinded and then woke up to the enemy that was attempting to control the world. The man who is rumored to carry a whip to emulate Jesus, whipping the money changers out of the temple. The man who loved his people and fought for his nation to control its destiny again. The man who was betrayed by those of his same race from different nations. We cannot betray him any further by soiling his legacy, just as the propaganda of the victors of the war has tarnished it. As the final sentence of the party program reads, "We National Socialists wave our storm banner before the world. Ever young, shining and glittering in the sun, rises the hooked cross, the symbol of reawakening life."